Welcome to what already is the fourth session of our History of the Book presentations. And I'm very excited to have probably a world first combination of languages, Tupi and Welsh. We'll be running it in that way that Mary first will present her work on what is the oldest manuscript, we think, of Tupi in the Bodleian library. Then Andrew Dunning will show the manuscript itself, and then we'll look at a Welsh pamphlet, which we believe is the earliest to be printed in Wales. And then Andrew Dunning will be showing some of the Welsh holdings from the Bodleian library. So that's the running order for today. And both of the editions that are discussed currently are already up on the Taylor Editions website. So under Editions MML or XAC UK, you'll find both Tupi and Tobacco, 2 T's. Both are still work in progress. We hope, as with the other editions done by the students, to add in further blogs, build in corrections, so your feedback is also welcome. And we'll also have a methodology workshop after the end of term where we'll be able to present updated versions of all the work that has been going on during this term. So we looked at the Tupi manuscript way back in the middle of a Hillary term, when Andrew Dunning was able to do the first measuring of the manuscript. And now yesterday, Mary was actually able for the first time to see the manuscript in the flesh, as it were. So I hand over to Mary to tell us what she discovered both yesterday and in the months before working on the manuscript.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my presentation. So hopefully you can all see that. So thank you very much for coming today to hear about Tupi. I'm very excited to share the work of really an entire year and the project that I came to Oxford to do. This is what I talked about on my application for the MST. So it's been a very exciting process to kind of now that it's to some degree come to fruition in this sense that I can now talk to you about it.
And Mary, do you want to try to maximize the screen?
Yes, sorry. I'm just trying to have my notes open as well.
Is that so better? That's perfect. That's very good.
Great.
The camera is also currently switched off. Is that by purpose?
Oh, no, sorry. I'm not very good at Microsoft Teams. Okay, that should be better. Okay. So today's presentation is a slightly shorter version of my research where I focus just on a couple things that I think are particularly interesting. I'll begin with a quick overview about my manuscript. Then I'll talk about what was essentially the first section of my project, in which I looked at the 4 known authors, all Jesuits, who were working in Tupi, and I did a paleographical comparison with their works just to confirm that MS Bodle 617 was not written by someone we actually know and was just kind of an unknown work by someone. Then I'm going to talk about the Twitter campaign I ran to see if anyone knew anything else, and offering hopefully a couple suggestions for future history of the book projects that I found about that. And then I will be finishing up with what will be, I'm sure, quite an interpretation of Our Father in Tupi taken from this manuscript. So if we begin, this is the full name of MS Bodle 617, no doutrina Christa na língua brasílica. I'm really sorry, my Portuguese, I'm quite good at reading, but my pronunciation is often more Spanish as I'm a Spanish student. It's around 105 folios, and it's written almost entirely as a dialogue. The first 7 or so folios are kind of more the basic, the lists of the 7 sins and stuff, but then all these are explained. It appears to be written in one hand. I have gone through very thoroughly and following several of the kind of the key graphs we can see. I think that it's one hand, perhaps with breaks taken in between, and definitely a change of paper quality around 2/3 of the way through, which would be interesting for other kind of a more material study. It was written in Tupi, which was the lingua franca of colonial Brazil. So Tupi kind of develops formally with the discovery of Brazil. Before with the discovery of Brazil, but then it formally becomes more of a used language with the arrival of the Jesuits in 1549, who at this point in their long history had realized the value of local indigenous languages in teaching local populations and also trade and other things. The roots of Tupi are somewhat difficult to figure out. There's some discussion of whether it was a mix of local languages regionally, where they kind of essentially created a master indigenous language to try and combine as many speakers as possible, or it was already the most spoken indigenous language that they picked up. Emma's Bottle 617 is particularly interesting because it's been dated to pre-1592, based on the fact that it was removed by Thomas Lodge, who was an alum of St. John's College, who went to Brazil, and we know from his records that he was in Brazil and left the area where it was held in 1592, and there was also then a fire in the church where it was held. So we know it cannot be past this date, but we don't know anything else about it, and there's no author given, which is very strange because every other work in and about Tupi has a known author, so it's kind of an anomaly in that sense. And it was given to the Bodleian by Sir Thomas Lodge in between 1630 and 1620. So that's kind of its history and how it got to the Bodleian. And then it has been there ever since. So quite exciting. So these are the four, sorry, my computer is not super responsive. These are the four main authors and their best known works in or about Tupi, mainly about Tupi. The first work that was kind of written in Tupi was the Catechismo, and that was 1618, and that was previously believed to be kind of the first work in Tupi, and that was printed. All of these were printed, although there are pages that you can see from the facsimile versions where they had occasionally written. So we have the Arte de Grammatica, which was kind of the first work in and about Tupi. So that's just a grammar. That was 1595. Then very interestingly, in 1631, the Jesuits realized that in order to perform confession, they needed a list of the body parts in Tupi so that people could describe how they'd sinned. And this was more important to them than a catechism, which was quite interesting. So that was 1630. Then you had a vocabulary, then you had the catechism. There are suggestions that there were earlier texts circulating way before this, and we know Anchieta and Valle and some of these other people had written notes that were going around, and they write in letters about sending these to various people. So that was kind of my question as to whether this was perhaps an earlier work by one of these known authors that had not made its way into print yet, or whether we're now talking about an entirely new person. So I'll just go quickly through my kind of paleographical conclusions and also how I got these samples of their writing, because in some of those cases it's kind of interesting and there was a decent amount of detective work. So Jose de Anchieta is perhaps the most famous person working in and on Tupi. He published a lot. There are plays, there are poems, and perhaps best known is his grammar. I eventually found a sample of his writing because the thought in terms of trying to find a sample of their writing was that letters would probably be the best form for this. And the Jesuits in Brazil were particularly known for constantly writing letters. So I kind of just searched surnames and carta in various online repositories. And I eventually found a series of kind of conference proceedings from 1900 which had been digitally scanned and which happened to include in them themselves a facsimile of a letter by Anchieta. And so I could compare this to MS617 just to see if it was the same hand. And we can see here from just the clearest examples were the majuscule T and the minuscule H and M. For instance, we can see that in MS617, there's always a crossbar on the T, and it's 3 strokes as opposed to Anchieta, whose T's are always 2 strokes. We can see similarly with Anchieta, there's the otiose stroke here at the bottom of the limb of the H. And we can also see an extended first minim on his minuscule M, as opposed to 3 very even minims on hand 617. So I could conclude that Anchieta was likely not the hand of this manuscript. So then we move on to Pero de Castillo, who was the one who wrote the book for Confessions. And we have another sample, and this was a facsimile included in the first printing of his work, which was around, I want to say, 1940. And that was the first printing made in France, and had this at the back. And I found a digitized version of the printed work from the recently printed work and managed to get this copy of his writing. And again, we can see here with the minuscule Y that both use 2 strokes, but both use a different set of strokes for these two. So Pero de Castillo, his first stroke is the long one that comes around here, and then we have the second stroke is the shorter right part of the Y, as opposed to in hand 617, where it's a very distinctively shaped minuscule Y, and you always have this very curved, almost horizontal left arm. Then again, we have the majuscule A, in which case in hand 617, it always has a very distinctive crossbar, which crosses the 2 verticals. And similarly, one of the clues that was perhaps most helpful across any paleographical study that I was doing was the form of the X, which in 617 is always kind of the 2 bowls of the C's kind of coming together, as opposed to the crossed limbs of the X in Castillo's writing. So again, not him. Then we go on to Leonardo del Valle. I will note that there has been some argument a while back as to whether they thought this script was by Leonardo del Valle himself. So what I can essentially say is that I've ruled out that it's not this writer of Tupi, whether or not that may or may not be Leonardo del Valle. And we can see here from the majuscule D, it's much more flourished in Valle's work, much more kind of the otiose stroke almost joins together so that you have a full circle there, as opposed to the extended stroke in 617. Again, we have the very distinctive X, and we also here have the descender in Valle's work is always very, very exaggerated. And if you look at this on the page, he has this very, very exaggerated descender, as opposed to in 617, where it's this kind of little flick and much more contained. And even when it is extended, there's pressure at different points. It's been written in just a different style. And that you can see that on examples, both in the G and the Ys. Then we have kind of a mystery document, which was by the first catechism that was printed. And there are also a lot, and something I would like to do in my final edition is compare the 2 versions, because there are a lot of similarities between this printed catechism and 617. So I thought it was particularly important to check if the hand of the catechism matched that of 617. The date given in the archive in which I found this, which I think was the National Archive of Sao Paulo, put it as written far too late, far too early, in that Araujo, while it said it was by Araujo would have been 12 if he had written this. So it made it impossible. But there is a very clearly written year on the manuscript itself of 1594, which would actually make it somewhat perfect for our manuscript, which is pre-1592. So, and considering that the catalogued information that went with this was really quite scant. I did email, and hopefully we'll get some follow-up as to what exactly was going on. So I compared it with this sample, but there is this kind of mystery as to whether or not this is the same Antonio de Araujo in this period. And here it's very clear, because we have two different forms of writing. I kind of don't need to break it down really letter by letter in terms of what we're looking at. It's not by him or by this writer at this period. So at the end of kind of this first part, we can say that of the four really major authors in Tupi, MS617 doesn't appear to be written by them. So now I'm going to go on to the other part, which was where I wanted to kind of crowdsource and see if anyone else had any other manuscripts that they could turn up. So I turned to Twitter following some of the classes we'd had, and I tweeted out kind of a 6-part tweet using a thread system that kind of set the challenge of, can Twitter find a manuscript? Looking for pre-1591, so the earlier date of when the fire was, just to kind of hedge my bets a little bit with that. And it actually did quite well. I was quite impressed, considering I had no use of Twitter beforehand, so everything was very new. I think I learned it about 2 days before I started the account and the campaign. We had over 22,000 impressions. These were screenshots that I just took yesterday, so they might be a little bit higher because I have had more activity on the account. We had quite a good way, was because I'd created this GIF, you could see media views into how many people kind of looked at it long enough for the GIF to play, which was quite a good way of seeing how many people probably read this versus just had the impression and kind of saw it on their newsfeed. So that was nearly 2,500, and we had 390 full engagements. So comments, shares, retweets, which was very exciting. I did have some interesting results, which I go to more in my essay, in which case they suggest fragments of works which may have either in one case exist in a photocopy form somewhere, which I'm trying to trace, and one case where there is a lost earlier manuscript, but it hasn't appeared in several centuries. So there's no real way of knowing whether or not that does still exist. And I managed to find a copy of Poems by Anchieta, and in the commentary on it, they did discuss how many of these works had simply not been kept properly and were kind of fused together and in very poor condition. And you could see that from the kind of the scans they'd included. So it's very possible that some of these works have just not survived into the present day, or have been lost between Brazil and Europe at some point, because they were being raided by persons such as Thomas Lodge, it seems, at various points. One of the things I thought was particularly interesting in relation to History of the Books campaigns was that I analyzed the language, the languages of the accounts who interacted with my Twitter campaign. I had initially decided to tweet in English and not Portuguese, as I didn't want multiple threads at once, as I felt that would be quite confusing in terms of trying to maximize the number of people who saw my post, and also considering the variety of libraries in which works in Tupi are held. So we have the Bodleian also is English speaking, but then I also know there are a couple of later works in the National Library in Paris. It didn't make sense to kind of go with Portuguese alone. So I made that decision, but as I made it, I was quite aware that that might be a little bit problematic in terms of then accessing a native speaking population of researchers. So I decided to follow that through. And as you can see, I got very low Portuguese speaking interaction. It's equal to bilingual Spanish and English interaction, and it was bilingual Spanish and English accounts that in fact gave me extra information about the manuscript. And I ascertained the language of the account by the language their bio was written in. And often there's the Twitter format as well, that you put your languages in emoji form in the bio. So I used that. And if I couldn't quite determine from that, then I scrolled into their tweets. So this would suggest for future history of the book campaigns, because most of them have been written in English, that it might be good if you're looking to target specific countries to actually just write in that language, because it doesn't seem to necessarily work in terms of interaction if you just go in English. So now I'm going to attempt to read the Our Father in Tupi, and I massively apologize. There are no tutorials since this is now kind of a dead language after the expulsion of the Jesuits. There's no real helpful YouTube video in this case. So this is just me trying to pronounce it. So, Orerube igbasipe tekora impete pigrama derera toiko tur de reino. Tonye monhag dere mitoya igbigpe igbasupe inye monyanga yabe. Ore ramio are bondo ara itig min bigramo. Ogoai big igbigapik teripe. Ara imo mosa pigsaba pupe. Te buero qui seco begabire. Oiupi. Igbasipe. Tuba opakuta bei te tiru. Monyanga ikutabi ekatu. Aba sotig seni. Aikui turi oiko bebai omamobe puera abe reko monyange. And I think it's very interesting to note that if you look for copies of Our Father in Tupi, there are quite a lot online where people have taken them, and none of them match the version given in MS617. So that's definitely something for further research. Furthermore, as you can see, so this is the section of Our Father across 2 folios. There's an added extensive section before we get to the Amen Jesu, where they're essentially naming the different roles of gods and where stuff has been in Tupi added to the traditional Our Father. So this traditional Our Father, the Catholic version, ends around here, and we have an extended version in Tupi. So that's definitely something for further research to get into, and looking at how perhaps tracing how Our Father has changed versus different versions in Tupi. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to have any questions, because I just have honestly far too much information about this manuscript that I'd be delighted to share. So thank you very much.
Brilliant, Mary, and well done for giving us a sound impression. I'm sure it will trigger a lot of discussion of what we can learn about languages just reading them from the page, and how much information is encoded in this. I hand over to Andrew to have a look at the manuscript itself. And Mary, you might want then to point out specific interesting features, also what you learned when looking for the first time at it in the flesh.
Yeah, so the first thing that hit me was how beautiful the cover is, because it's almost see-through and you can kind of see the MS Bodle 617 through the cover. I just thought it was very beautiful. I was quite like, oh, look at this, finally holding it. But I'm not the expert on covers, as I didn't do a materiality-based study. So Dr. Dunning will probably know far more about it than I.
As you said, it will be interesting for further studies also to look at watermarks, for example, and of the paper. So the cover itself, I think, Andrew, it's parchment with parchment threads running through to.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and this is actually fairly. I think this is a pretty standard type of binding for this period. It may have actually been, that may have been from the Bodleian itself, I think.
It was trimmed at one point, and you can see see that in the letters. So it's very possible that it was rebound by the Bodleian, I guess, when it came to the Bodleian.
Yeah. So, Mary, you finally saw the manuscript for the first time yesterday. What struck you? What really hit you beyond the cover?
I was really interested. Something I could kind of see from the scans was that you could tell by the thickness of paper the shift in the later part of the manuscript. And I really would like to get into that, whether it was written at a different period, whether it was perhaps two versions of the text that were put together. You almost have to feel the thickness to figure it out. I also noted that if on the back folios, the pages, if you turn it upside down, someone has noted on the pages like what should be written in other sections. So you can see in this really small print there on that folio, someone has marked out as if that paper was going to be used for something else, and it's in another hand. And I just found that quite interesting in just terms of like whether that was the Bodleian in terms of they had bound and added extra pages, or whether that was the Jesuits themselves.
That's certainly not. That definitely does not look like something from the Bodleian, I would say.
Yeah. So it gives us some clues when we don't have really anything about the manuscript's kind of history pre-coming to the Bodleian, about the production of pedagogical texts at this period, this very early period in Jesuit Brazil, which is always exciting, kind of figuring out how they were practically trying to make things to diffuse their language, both to them and to indigenous speakers fluent in other languages.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise it's quite simply written. It has some interesting pilcrows. I wonder if the scribe got a little bit bored, because they kind of get more and more interesting as you go along, and then they go back to being quite simple. It's mainly in this column format, and the columns have been established. There's a double kind of ruling mark, which I only saw yesterday. I was kind of, I hadn't known before. So they'd use that to keep it kind of straight in order. Yeah. You've got little titles for all the various sections. So they have discussions about different things. They discuss here the sign of the cross. They discuss at other points. They have matrimony. The only section that is in Portuguese, very interestingly, is the section giving instructions on how to perform the rites to someone who is dying. And that's, I guess, was considered so important and perhaps needed for emergencies that they kept that in Portuguese so it could be really quickly accessed, which would suggest that this was being used by Portuguese-speaking Jesuits primarily, who were trying to use Tupi, because on the important things, it's kept it in Portuguese. In my digital edition, I have marked all the Portuguese in red, because interestingly, several important terms have also been kept in Portuguese. So for instance, the word for grace is kept in Portuguese. The Virgin Mary, the Holy Spirit is kept in Portuguese. God is translated into Tupi, and the word for God is tupa, which means thunder. That was the word that they came up for to kind of translate the concept of God. So for further study, I thought it would be good to quickly highlight Portuguese words as opposed to Tupi. So yeah, that's 617.
Fascinating. And then there is another version of the Our Father. So this is what you said. This kind of catechismal question and answer explanation of the text itself.
Yeah. I never figured out. So it switches. Most of it, the question is given with M, and then the answer is given with D. And this switches towards the end in towards a more classic. And they also explain it in towards of pergunta and resposta. So that's quite standard. But they don't tell you what the M and D is. And then they just switch to kind of the standard. So I hadn't figured out what quite they meant by that. So yeah.
That's
fascinating. Yeah.
That's probably derived from medieval question and answer books. It probably just stands for Discipulus and Magister, or
that's yeah, very probable. Yeah.
Very interesting. No, it's good to know that, because it was interesting, and then it's also interesting why they decided to switch, because they do switch quite randomly to the more modern, I guess, version. So, and they also switch column direction at the same. No, they switch column direction just before. So previously, you have in the left-hand column, you always have the question, and then it's answered in the right hand going across. And at this point, as you can see, the columns are converted to how we would almost normally read columns going down. So you have it stacked MD, MD, MD. And that, again, that switch occurs randomly at one point. It makes sense because you can fit far more questions and answers in the paper in this order. So perhaps someone at some point realized, I'm using up too much paper, I need to get more in here, I'll switch.
Brilliant. I think there are lots more questions that people will want to ask, but for now I'll switch over to Lois and her edition of the first book printed in Wales, which is also available now as a digital edition on the Taylor Editions website. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, today I'll be speaking to you about my history of the book project, which was on a Welsh language 8-page ballad pamphlet called Can o Senn yw hen Feistr Tobacco, which includes a ballad and a couple of short poems by Alban Thomas, warning against the dangers of tobacco. And it's recognised to be the first book printed in a press in Wales, and it's from 1718. And it's the basis of my digital edition, which is now live. And the print gives us some kind of suggestions to help us create a narrative about the conditions in which the print was made. And yeah, I'd also like to add a full disclaimer here. I've not actually been able to consult the object in real life yet. It's being kept in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. So all the observations I've made based on the National Library of Wales's digitisation of the text are going to be confirmed when it will be possible for me, hopefully, to go see it. So yeah, I was quite jealous of Mary actually having, been able to actually consult the thing that you've been working on for such a long time. But despite the limitations of that, and the fact that I've only been able to consult facsimile images, it's still been possible to make some interesting observations that tell us a little bit more about the creation of the print and the first printing house that was established in Wales. And the history of book printing in Wales spans a strikingly short period of time. It begins over 250 years after the invention of Gutenberg's press. And it was first established, as I said, in 1718, which is only 3 years prior to the first Welsh language book to be printed as far as Philadelphia. And the vast majority of early Welsh printed books are devotional texts that were printed in London and then elsewhere in England, but mainly in Oxford and Chester and Shrewsbury. And the first book printed in the Welsh language, referred to as Y Llyfr Hwn, in this book dates to around 1546 or 1547, and that was printed in London. And although it is Can or Senn that is seen as the first book to be printed in a printing press in Wales, it is believed that the Counter-Reformation text, Edrych Christianogol, was the first, but that was printed illegally in a cave in North Wales around 1586. And, you know, the details are kind of precarious. So it slightly nullifies the claim that Can or Senn is the first ever book to be printed in Wales. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that this pamphlet is the first Welsh language book to be printed in an official printing press in Wales. So that makes it an exceptionally important piece of Welsh cultural history. And I hadn't heard of it before doing some kind of background research into the history of printing in Wales. So I became interested in the object just because of its historical and cultural importance, and I think that people should know more about it, and hopefully this will kind of boost engagement with the resource more generally. And also National Library of Wales, who holds the only known copy of the print, so that makes it all the more important that it's digitised and accessible for people everywhere. So yeah, looking closely at how the 1718 ballads printed gives us an insight into the printer Isaac Carter's printing press in the village of Trefhedyn, now called Adpar, in Carmarthenshire. And we can tell from Isaac Carter's rather shoddy printing in his work that he was experimenting and he had not perfected his craft when he was printing this. So we can tell that he was inexperienced, since the inking is of poor quality to the extent that some words become unintelligible. So in the bottom image there, the ascender of the letter T in Gwylltio did not come out, and I was scratching my head for a long time, and I actually got David Willis's help here to actually realise that that was a T. So it doesn't help the reader, and we can see other instances where, you know, letters have not come out or the inking is a little bit all over the place. And it could be that the printing was done, you know, with little care or at haste, but the fact that the typesetting is quite inconsistent throughout does suggest that it was more to do with the inexperience of the printing house and possibly as well its limited materials. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Yes, so the title even is not the same from one page to another. So that's, I think, a really striking example of the inconsistency. So on the title page, we see Ew, it's kind of two heads, is written IW, and then on the next page it's YW. And, you know, you could say that the discrepancy could be due to flexible spelling standards in the 18th century, especially because this is quite low literature, because it was a ballad. But it is not good printing practice, especially for the title of the work. So yes, maybe it was due to Isaac Carter's indifference or carelessness, but it might also be because of material limitations, because the title on the second page is italicized. So perhaps that there was a shortage of italicized I types, and that they just had to make do with the Y instead. Not sure. Could we move on to the next slide, please? And then again, we've got, you know, arbitrary capitals and italics all over the place, and also they use the long S and round S types interchangeably throughout. So we can see on the top left here, gas, it has the round S, and then we've got maswedd on the same line. Again, it's an S, but that's a long S. So it does make us think that they just had to make do with whatever type they could kind of get their hands on. And yeah, there are many instances of arbitrary capitals and italics too. And I found that there was a stark prominence of the letter B being represented as an italicized capital, which suggests that they probably had fewer lowercase b types than required. And if we look around the pamphlet, around what else was printed at the same place and at the same time, we see another pamphlet printed by Isaac Carter in 1718, which is on the right here, that has the same but with capital italic M's. So quite a trend that appears in a couple of the works. And then we can tell as well that Isaac Carter was working with limited resources, because the pamphlet is very modestly decorated. So there's a plain border on the title page, and then a small woodcut ornament that you can see on the left there at the head of the second page. Although it is more ornate than the other pamphlet with the italicized M's that I just mentioned, that was printed in the same year. But by 1719, a year after Can or Senn was printed, Isaac Carter printed Thomas Vincent's Eglurhadol Catechism Byraf y Gymanfa, which was 445 pages long, which is, you know, quite a big feat compared to the 8-page ones from the previous year. But the only ornamentation is the same ornament that features on the second page of Can or Senn, although the typesetting is much more consistent by them. We know that, you know, for a couple of years at least, the printing press at Trefhedyn did have very limited materials with only one kind of woodcut ornament. And then 4 years after printing Can or Senn, Isaac Carter printed a 112-page book, Douce Fawrym Byched Grefyddol, and we see that he had acquired much more kind of decorational materials by then, since we've got woodcuts at the beginning and ends of each chapter. So we've got one example there on the right. So definitely acquired much more over the years. And this is, you know, although still relatively plain, much more lavish than the first work printed on the left. Could we move on to the next slide? And yeah, they were obviously just trying to make do with as much as they could, because at the beginning it seems that they couldn't afford to leave empty spaces on the paper, and they were quite economical, because on page 7 of the pamphlet here, Isaac Carter writes just under the kind of separator line, he says hen englyn a sota di mewn I gyflawni'r ddalen, which means an old Englyn poem inserted to fill the page, so as to, you know, fill the page, make sure that nothing was left empty and that they made the most of each part of paper that they could. And so, you know, from looking at and around the printed work, we can trace the improvement in Isaac Carter's printing, and we can see how the press became better equipped over time. And in comparison to the other works printed later at Trefhedyn, Can or Senn is quite a poor quality print, and it might be more of a kind of practice run than a book that was intended to be widely sold and disseminated. But the aim of making the digital edition was mainly to encourage people just to engage with the text and take an interest in this important object in Welsh kind of cultural history. And so I've used the advantages of XML encoding to make reading the text hopefully a little bit easier for people who are unfamiliar with 18th century Welsh orthography. So on the digital edition, you'll see that spellings have been updated to be more in line with modern Welsh conventions. You'll see them in the words that have been updated are in blue. But then, so as of course, this might impair the rhyme and the meter. So it's intended more as a kind of guide to the readers rather than a replacement of the original language. And so what you can do is, if you hover by the words in blue that have been updated, you will see the original spelling as well. So I've put an example there of the title. And yeah, so far I've been focusing on the materiality of the object rather than the actual content of the text. And so the project is still a bit of a work in progress, and I hope to move on to looking at the literary content next, and hopefully I'll be able to work on that and provide either an English translation or at least an English summary of the text to go alongside the original, just for kind of general interest in what the content of the pamphlet is. And in addition to this, it would be really great if I could facilitate an audio recording of someone singing the ballad that I could include in the digital edition. The first page mentions, or I think, although I might be wrong, but I think that is intended to be sung to the tune of Brunnen Lass. And I'm not much of a singer, so if someone would like to volunteer to help me out with this, I would be very grateful. But yeah, after including these elements to the digital edition, I hope that a wider audience will be encouraged to kind of re-engage with this kind of important piece of Welsh cultural history, and that you can consult the digital edition. Yeah.
Brilliant. And actually, I had today an email from Andrew Cusworth, who is a musicologist working at the Bodleian and worked at the National Library of Wales before that, and he would be quite eager to help perform it. So another project for the methodology workshop at the end of the term. So Andrew has brought for us, just to get an impression of how such a pamphlet in Welsh looked like, a more or less contemporary example of a pamphlet. So Andrew, if you could talk us through that.
Yeah, so although we don't have the actual pamphlets that Lois worked on, we do have the wonderful, absolutely wonderful librarian at Jesus College recommended two similar examples. Now this one right here is, this one's from 1731, and this has this has what I'm told is called a mourning border on the front, and you can see it again right right there. And you'll notice that very similar to the pamphlet that we've just been discussing, the type is not. It strikes me that the type I haven't actually sat down. The typeface is certainly very, very similar to the one that you were looking at, and it's somewhat produced on the fly. It's not extraordinarily well inked. You can see that, I mean, this page is much fainter than this one, which is, so going back, which is actually, this one is somewhat over inked, really. And, but this gives you an impression of the scale of these things. This really is just a tiny little pamphlet that's been bound into a larger volume of pamphlets. I find it rather interesting that, incidentally, that while the entirety of these books are in Welsh, a lot of the advertising information is in English. So here we have an advertisement which I believe goes with I didn't quite figure this out, but I think this goes with the previous pamphlet. This one isn't. This is entirely in English, the advertisement. Incidentally, you'll notice that the list of booksellers on this in this list are rather interesting. There's one in Chester. There's one of them's at Jesus College in Oxford, and then in the back of this, there's a rather nice little advertisement again in English for Thomas Paine, bookseller in Wrexham, who he tells us sells books in all faculties: Bibles, common prayer books, shop books, pocket books, gilt and plain writing paper, with all other sorts of stationery, and at the lowest prices, and gives most money for any library or a parcel of books. Sorry, it's rather fun.
Yeah.
Lois, is there anything that you would like to add about this one? I have one more to show.
No, this isn't the one that has just 8 pages, is it?
No, that's the next one.
Good, yeah, then.
Yes.
Because one of the points I wanted to make really about Lois' pamphlet is that it's actually just one broad side folded twice to form these 8 pages.
Yes.
So similar to really the earliest examples that we have in printing from Germany, where the money wasn't made with the big Bibles, but rather with the occasional printing of calendars and advertisements.
So this is the other. This is one's from 1745, and this volume as a whole, again, a whole collection of different tracts that have been, and pamphlets that have been bound together. This may, if you saw our Luther tracts last week, then this will remind you of that. And so we have our tiny little, it took a bit to find it here, but here's our tiny little 8-page pamphlet right here. So it's right, just these.
It's much smaller than you'd imagine, isn't it?
Yes, you can see in comparison to my hand, it's quite tiny, in fact.
So does it say, any of the Welsh speakers?
So that's rheolau yr ysgolion Cymraeg, so the rules of the Welsh schools, and a letter to everyone who had been kind of living in kind of proximity to them.
Great.
This one is much more tidily printed than the tract from the pamphlet from 31 on theirs.
But still very kind of simple and not
very simple.
And the same type of, for example, page numbers in brackets, and there's a similar typeface as well. Many thanks for making the materiality available again, and a huge thanks to both our speakers.
Thank you, diolch.